My sister said. She deserved payment for raising her son because I never had children of my own. So I handed her an invoice that wrecked her marriage. She slid a folder across the Thanksgiving table like she was serving me a subpoena. Sign this, Renee said. It's a child support agreement for non-parents. I laughed. Nobody else did. The turkey was still steaming in the middle of Grandma Jones' dining table. My mother had just passed the cranberry sauce. The good china was out. The plates rimmed in a faded gold my grandmother had owned since her own wedding in 1968. My sister was staring at me with the flat, prepared expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her car in the driveway before she'd even come inside. She wasn't joking. Renee had typed up an actual document, 3 full pages, with a signature line at the bottom and a notary block she hadn't filled in yet. She called it a childless tax. She said women like me had been dodging our duty to the next generation for years, and it was time to pay up. You want to walk everyone through the math, I said. Or should I guess? I've done the math, she said, and pulled a second sheet from the folder. A breakdown of diapers, daycare copays, and pediatrician visits going back to Mason's birth. Numbers she'd clearly pulled off some parenting blog and inflated to suit her point. This is what it costs to raise a child in this country. You've had all the benefits of a nephew and none of the bill. Those are your bills, I said. Not mine. I never agreed to split them. That's exactly the problem, she said, loud enough that my uncle's fork paused halfway to his mouth. You think love is free? It's not. Somebody pays for it. It's just never been you. My Aunt Peg gasped audibly. My grandmother set down her fork with a small, deliberate click against the china. Nobody defended me. They just watched, waiting to see what I'd do, like this was dinner theater instead of my life. Renee, this isn't the time, my mother started. No, it's exactly the time, Renee said. Everyone's here. Everyone should know how this family actually works. Then she dropped the real number. $42,000. Back pay, she said. For 7 years of Mason's life, I hadn't financially supported. You've been freeloading off this family, she told the whole table, loud enough that I saw my grandmother's neighbor's porch light flick on through the window. Taking him to the park, buying him gifts, acting like his aunt without paying a cent toward raising him. That's not how child support works, I said. That's not how anything works. It's discrimination, she snapped. Childless people expect all the joy of family without any of the cost. She said Mason was basically my part-time child. She compared herself to a surrogate. Surrogates get paid, she said. Why shouldn't she? You get all the fun parts of being a mom, she said. The hugs, the birthdays, the bedtime stories, and you don't pay 1 cent for any of it. That's not fair to him. I looked at her face while she said it. Her lips were fuller than they'd been at Easter. Her jaw was sharper, freshly contoured. $8,000 of work she'd had done at a clinic downtown that spring. I thought about the text she'd sent me in September, the one that said she couldn't afford Mason's $40 field trip fee. Then came the threat. Pay up or I'd never see my nephew again. I didn't sign anything. I smiled, the kind of smile you give a stranger who's cut you off in traffic, and told her I needed time to think. Take your time, she said, but the clock's already running. I helped clear plates like nothing had happened. I hugged my grandmother goodbye, held on a second longer than usual, the way you do when you need something solid to steady yourself against. I got in my car, and I sat in the dark of Grandma Jones' driveway for 11 minutes before I trusted myself to drive, watching my breath fog the windshield, replaying the specific silence of a room full of people who'd chosen not to defend me. The drive home took 22 minutes on the back roads, past the church my grandmother still attended, past the elementary school Renee and I had both gone to a decade apart, past the dairy freeze on Route 9 with its lights already off for the night. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, I wasn't angry anymore, not in the loud way I'd expected to be. I was doing math. I sat in my kitchen with the lights off for a long while, my coat still on, before I finally opened my laptop. That night, I started building my own folder. I am 34 years old. I run a small bookkeeping practice out of a rented office on Delmar Street in Brookhaven, Ohio, 3 exam rooms down from a dentist and above a shuttered dry cleaner. I do the books for a landscaping company, 2 dental practices, a wedding photographer, and a family-owned hardware store that's been open since 1974. I chose this life. I chose not to have children, not out of some grievance against motherhood, but because I like my quiet apartment and my Sunday mornings and the particular freedom of a life that answers to nobody but me. I dated someone seriously in my late 20s, a man named Greg who wanted kids badly enough that we eventually agreed, kindly, that we wanted different lives, and I've never once regretted the choice that came out of that ending. I have never once resented anyone their children. Until that Thanksgiving, I would have said the same was true of my sister. Renee is 38. She married Todd Voss 9 years ago in a barn venue outside Springfield that cost our parents $6,000 they didn't really have. She works part-time for Heartland Realty, though part-time has always been generous. Most months she shows 2 or 3 houses and spends the rest of her hours on Instagram, curating a version of her life that looks like a catalog spread. Todd works as a regional sales manager for Bennett Distribution, the kind of steady, unglamorous job that pays a mortgage and doesn't ask for much credit in return. Mason was born 7 years ago in March at Brookhaven Memorial, and I was in the waiting room with my parents for 11 hours because Renee wanted family close, even the family she'd later decide didn't count. Growing up, Renee was always the one things happened to. She was the one who got the bigger bedroom because she was older. She was the one whose wedding got the barn and the string lights, while my law school graduation 4 years earlier got a dinner at Olive Garden because we already spent so much on the wedding fund. happened. I remember standing in the parking lot afterward while my mother handed me a card with $200 in it and told me how proud she was. And I remember believing her, mostly, while also noticing that Renee's engagement announcement 2 months later got a party with a rented photo booth. I don't say this to sound bitter. I noticed it, cataloged it, and moved on, the same way I've moved on from most things about my family. But it built something in Renee that I didn't fully understand until much later. A conviction, bone deep, that the world owed her a certain kind of spectacle, and that anyone who didn't provide it was withholding something rightfully hers. I want to be fair to her too, because that's the only way this story is worth telling. Renee wasn't cruel as a kid. She was funny and loud and generous in the specific way older siblings can be when they still think of you as something to protect rather than compete with. She used to save me the good cereal prize before I was tall enough to reach the box myself. Somewhere between then and her wedding day, that generosity hurtled into something that needed an audience to feel real. I don't know exactly when. I only know I spent 30 years hoping the version of her from the cereal box would show back up eventually, if I was patient enough. Our parents didn't help. My father grew up the youngest of 5 in a house with more mouths than money, and I think some unexamined part of him decided early on that the way you show love is with celebration. Big gestures, bigger parties, the kind of visible generosity that photographs well. Renee, older and louder and more willing to perform gratitude on cue, absorbed that attention easily. I was quieter, more interested in numbers than applause, and by the time I was choosing a college major, my parents had already settled into a shorthand where Renee's milestones were occasions and mine were updates. Nobody meant harm by it. I don't think either of them could tell you, even now, that they did anything differently between their 2 daughters. But Renee noticed the pattern before I did, and she built an entire personality around making sure the spotlight never drifted too far from her for too long. The Louis Vuitton bag wasn't the first time money and image collided in a way that should have told me something. Back in 2019, 3 years before the preschool loan, Renee spent $11,000 on her wedding dress alone. A number I only know because I helped my mother track the vendor payments in a spreadsheet, not unlike the ones I'd eventually billed against her. At the time, I told myself it was a wedding, a once-in-a-lifetime thing, the kind of expense you don't begrudge someone you love. I still believe that, mostly. I only mention it now because I can see, looking backward, how long the pattern had actually been running, a need for spectacle that always seemed to outpace what she could actually afford, quietly backfilled by whoever loved her enough not to ask questions. There was an earlier incident, 3 years before that Thanksgiving, that I filed away at the time and only understood later for what it was. In the fall of 2022, Renee called me in a panic. Mason's preschool, Little Sprouts Academy, needed a deposit by Friday, or he'd lose his spot for the year. $3,000, she said. Money. Todd didn't know she'd let lapse, because she'd missed the enrollment window twice already. I transferred it that afternoon. She promised to pay me back within 2 months, the second she got her fall commission checks in. She never did. I brought it up once, gently, over coffee the following spring, and she looked at me like I'd asked her to donate a kidney. "I can't believe you're keeping score," she said. "It's for your nephew." I let it go. 2 weeks later, she posted a photo of a new Louis Vuitton bag, captioned, "Treated myself," and I told myself it wasn't my business how she spent her money once the preschool bill was paid. I didn't connect the two things. I had no reason to, not yet. There was a second incident too, one I only remembered clearly once Todd started asking questions. The spring after Mason turned 5, Renee called our grandmother in tears, saying a lawyer wanted $2,000 upfront to handle a custody scare, some vague story about a background check flag at Mason's school that needed to be cleared before he could stay enrolled. Grandma Joan wired the money the same day, the way she'd wire money to any of us if we said the word emergency. Renee thanked her with a bouquet of flowers and never mentioned it again. Nobody asked to see the lawyer's invoice. Nobody thought to. That's the thing about a family built on trust. Nobody keeps receipts until somebody teaches them they have to. Todd is a good man, or he was, before all of this. He's not the type to get pulled into family drama. He calls Renee's mother Mom and calls my mother Carol, and he keeps his head down at holidays and lets the Whitfield women handle their own business. He'd grown up the youngest of 4 brothers in a house where money was tight and nobody ever hid a receipt from anybody else. And I think that made him a poor match, in some ways, for a wife who'd learned the opposite lesson. He trusted Renee completely, the way you trust someone you've built a life with, which meant he trusted her explanations for things without asking many follow-up questions. He worked long hours at Bennett Distribution, took on extra territory the year Mason turned 4 so Renee could focus on being present, and never once, as far as I know, asked to see a bank statement in 9 years of marriage. I don't say that to blame him. I say it because it's the exact condition a lie like Renee's needs in order to survive for over a decade. Mason is the best part of all of it. He's got Renee's dimples and Todd's stubborn quiet, and by 6, he already had an encyclopedic knowledge of dinosaurs that could out-talk any adult in the room. Since he was a baby, I've had him every Wednesday afternoon, free of charge, while Renee ran what she called errands. I picked him up from Brookhaven Elementary once he started kindergarten, drove him to the park on Kessler Avenue, made him grilled cheese, helped with his reading homework, sat through a solid year of him narrating the entire plot of whatever dinosaur documentary he'd watched that week. It was never a burden. It was the best 4 hours of my week, most weeks. Renee would text around 6, saying she she was at training, and I never questioned it. She'd gotten serious about fitness after Mason was born, joined a gym called Ironclad Fitness off Route 9, and I chalked up the long absences to spin classes and new mom self-care. In hindsight, there were details I noticed without registering. The way her phone would light up during dinner with a contact saved as Mason's swim coach, even though Mason didn't take swimming that year and never had. The way she'd come back from training, freshly showered, hair still damp, makeup redone, smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't Todd's. I filed it under things that weren't my business. That's the thing about a slow betrayal. It doesn't look like anything until someone hands you the whole shape of it at once. By the time she slid that folder across the Thanksgiving table, I'd spent 7 years thinking my sister and I had a relationship built on something real, even if it was lopsided. Even if I'd always been the one absorbing the cost of her chaos. I didn't know yet how literal that would turn out to be. The Monday after Thanksgiving, my phone started buzzing before 8 in the morning. Renee, have you thought about it? Renee, Mason asked why you weren't answering your texts. Renee, this isn't about money, it's about respect. You've never respected what I do. I didn't respond right away. I made coffee. I opened a spreadsheet. I spent that whole week building it. 7 years of Wednesday afternoons, dated back to Mason's first spring, itemized at $20 an hour, 4 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, accounting for the times I'd covered emergency pickups when Renee's showings ran long or she'd simply forgotten. $30,160. I built a second sheet for gifts, birthdays, Christmases, the Easter basket I'd assembled every year since he was 1, the $200 I'd spent on his bike for his 6th birthday, the ice cream cones from the Dairy Freeze on Route 9 that I'd never once made him pay for, with a modest 3% annual interest applied, the same courtesy she'd extended to me in her own paperwork. $15,400, $45,560 total, printed, stapled, and mailed to her house on Cardinal Lane with a note clipped to the front page. Family doesn't charge for babysitting, but since we're doing this now. She called me screaming 40 minutes after the mail would have arrived, which told me she'd been checking the box obsessively. Family doesn't send invoices, she shouted. You did, I said, at Thanksgiving, in front of Grandma. That's completely different, and you know it. Explain the difference, I said. I'm listening. She hung up. 10 minutes later, she called back and said nothing at all, just breathed into the phone for 8 seconds before hanging up again. I sat at my kitchen table and realized my hands weren't even shaking. I'd expected to feel guilty. I felt instead like I'd finally set something down I'd been carrying without noticing the weight of it. She regrouped fast. 2 days later, my mother called, her voice doing the careful, conflict-averse thing it always does when she's been recruited. Your sister says you're punishing her, my mother said. She says the invoice really hurt her feelings. She's been under a lot of stress, honey. You know Mason wasn't easy after she had that rough patch with her anxiety a few years back. I hadn't heard about a rough patch with her anxiety. I doubted my mother had specifics either. It was the kind of vague, sympathetic phrase Renee had learned to deploy whenever she needed cover. Mental health as a shield, wheeled out only when convenient, never mentioned in the years I'd have actually wanted to help if it were true. I'm not punishing anyone, I told my mother. I responded to what she started. If she wants to tear up both documents, I'll tear up mine. Can't you just apologize for peace? For what exactly? My mother didn't have an answer for that. I told her I loved her and got off the phone before I said something I'd regret. Renee's next move was to widen the circle. She called Todd's mother, Linda, in Columbus, and told her a version of events where I'd sent a harassing legal document demanding money from a grieving new mother, a phrase that made Mason sound like an infant rather than a healthy 7-year-old with a mouthful of dinosaur facts. Linda, who barely knew me beyond a handful of holidays, called me directly to ask what on earth was going on. I sent her photos of the actual Thanksgiving folder, the actual notary block, and let her draw her own conclusions. She apologized within the hour and told me, almost sheepishly, that Renee had asked her for money once too, 2 years back, something about covering a hospital copay for Mason's tonsils. Linda had sent $400 without blinking. Mason had never had his tonsils out. I added the note to the list building quietly in my phone. Renee tried our cousin Kayla next, then a woman from her book club, then apparently a former co-worker from her first real estate job. Each version of the story sanded down or sharpened depending on the audience. Each one designed to make me the villain of a story she was still, somehow, controlling the narration of. It didn't work the way she needed it to. People kept calling me back afterward, confused, comparing notes, and every comparison chipped another piece off whatever story she was building. Renee's next move was worse. I found out about it from Mason himself on a Wednesday 2 weeks later, when he climbed into my car after school looking smaller than usual. Mom said you don't love me for free anymore, he said, staring at his shoes. She said you might not want to pick me up if she doesn't pay you. I pulled the car over on Kessler Avenue before I trusted myself to answer him. That's not true, I told him. I will always want to pick you up. That's never going to change. Not for any reason. He nodded, but I could see him turning it over. The particular confusion of a 7-year-old who's just learned that adults sometimes use you to hurt each other. A lesson no kid that age should have to sit with alone in the backseat of a car. I didn't say a word against his mother. I bought him a Dairy Freeze cone, the same as always, and I drove him home 40 minutes later than usual because I wasn't ready to hand him back into that house yet. I called Todd that night after Mason had gone to bed and told him what Mason had said in the car. He went quiet on the line for a long moment. She told him that, he said. Not quite a question. I said, said yes. He apologized on Renee's behalf, the way he always did that winter, a reflex he hadn't yet learned to retire, and told me he'd talk to her about it. I don't know if he ever did. I know Mason never repeated it to me again, though I sometimes wondered afterward what else he'd absorbed and simply learned not to say out loud. 2 days after that, Renee tried something new. She called me directly, her voice pitched low and urgent, and told me Mason's asthma had flared up badly enough that he'd needed a nebulizer treatment at urgent care. $600 she, obviously, couldn't cover this month, given everything going on between us. I hadn't heard anything about an asthma diagnosis in 7 years of Wednesday afternoons. Not one inhaler in his backpack, not one mention from his teacher or his pediatrician's office, whose number I still had from the one time I'd taken him in myself for a fever when Renee's phone had gone straight to voicemail for 6 hours. I asked gently which urgent care they'd gone to. She named a clinic across town I happened to know had closed the previous year. She hung up before I could mention it. I didn't say anything to Renee about it. I didn't need to. I started talking instead, carefully, honestly, to the people who'd ask. Not exaggerating, not editorializing, just telling them what had actually happened. To our parents. To Renee's oldest friend, Bethany, who called me confused after Renee had apparently told her some garbled version where I was the aggressor. To my grandmother, who I told everything to, in full, because she deserved better than the dinner theater version she'd already watched play out at her own table. People were disgusted, not at me. Bethany texted me a single line. She asked me for money for Mason's daycare last spring. I thought that was weird at the time. I didn't respond to that immediately. I wrote it down instead, in a note on my phone, the same instinct that had built the invoice in the first place. Something about the timeline nagged at me. Renee had asked several people for money over the past few years, always tied to Mason, always urgent, always just slightly larger than what the stated expense would actually cost. The last thing she tried, before the dinner that broke everything open, happened at Mason's school winter concert in the gymnasium at Brookhaven Elementary, folding chairs lined up under fluorescent lights while second graders sang off-key about snowflakes. I'd come, the way I came to everything of his. Renee spotted me from across the room and made a show of it, loud enough for the parents around her to hear, saying she was surprised I'd found the time to show up for free. A woman I didn't know turned to look at me with open pity, like I was the one who'd said something cruel in a school gymnasium during a children's concert. I didn't respond. I found a seat near the back, clapped for Mason when his class came up, and left before the reception, because I didn't trust myself to stay polite for another minute. Todd found me in the parking lot afterward, apologized on Renee's behalf in a tired voice that didn't sound like it believed its own words anymore, and told me he'd talk to her. I didn't know yet how close he already was to finding out why she needed an audience so badly, or why the applause of strangers had started to matter more to her than the truth. The blow-up that mattered happened 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, at my parents' kitchen table. Over a Sunday dinner my mother had engineered specifically to clear the air. Renee arrived defensive, already sniping about how the whole family had turned against her over a misunderstanding. Todd sat beside her, quieter than usual, his jaw tight in a way I hadn't seen before. The particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic in his head that he didn't like the answer to. Somewhere between the pot roast and dessert, my father made an offhand comment about the cosmetic work Renee had gotten that spring. Not accusatory, just a dad being tactless comment about how much things cost these days. Renee laughed it off. Todd did. How much did that cost? He asked her quietly, but not quietly enough. Todd, not now. How much, Renee? She said a number that was lower than the one I knew from her own Instagram captions bragging about her glow-up package. Todd's face went the color of a tomato. He grabbed her arm, not roughly, but with a grip that made clear this conversation wasn't optional, and pulled her into the hallway off the kitchen. I busied myself with dessert plates. Everyone else at the table suddenly got very interested in their phones. Through the doorway, I could see Renee waving her arms, explaining herself in the fast, overlapping way she talks when she's cornered. Todd just kept shaking his head, pointing toward the front door. Then he said something I couldn't hear that made her go pale, her whole posture collapsing inward like a tent losing its pole. They left minutes later without saying goodbye to Mason, who'd been in the living room the entire time, oblivious, watching cartoons on my mother's old television. My mother sat frozen at the table, her napkin twisted into a tight knot in her lap. Nobody said a word for a full minute. My phone rang at 8 the next morning. It was Todd. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I need those invoices, Todd said. His voice sounded like he hadn't slept. All of them. Every receipt, every date, everything you sent her. I told him I'd email the spreadsheets that morning. He didn't say much else, just thanked me, twice, in a flat voice that scared me more than if he'd been shouting. He'd spent the night going through their bank statements, he told me later, after Renee had gone to bed pretending nothing had happened. He'd found the $8,000 at the cosmetic clinic downtown, charged to a card he didn't usually monitor, and matched it against a text message Renee had sent me back in September, the one where she'd sworn she couldn't afford Mason's field trip fee. Same week, same month my babysitting invoice covered. He'd started pulling the thread, and once he started, he couldn't stop. 2 days later, we met at a coffee shop called the Grindhouse on Main Street, a few blocks from my office. Todd looked wrecked, dark circles under his eyes, a wrinkled shirt he'd clearly slept in the night before, or not slept in at all. He ordered a black coffee and didn't touch it. I opened my laptop and walked him through everything. 7 years of receipts. Every date lined up beside her spending month by month. A ledger of a decade he apparently hadn't known he needed. Start from the beginning, he said. I want to see all of it, not just the parts that make her look bad. All of it. I respected that more than I expected to. So I did. The good years too. The Christmases where she genuinely seemed happy. The summer she'd organized a surprise 40th birthday party for our father that had taken real effort and real love to pull off. Todd nodded along, quiet, absorbing it, like a man trying to hold on to a version of his marriage even while watching the floor of it get pulled away plank by plank. His hands were shaking by the third spreadsheet. He kept whispering the same word under his breath. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Then he stopped scrolling. He went completely still, staring at a line I hadn't even flagged myself. A small entry I'd included almost as an afterthought. The $3,000 I'd sent Renee in 2022 for Mason's preschool deposit. Wait, he said, turning the laptop toward me. Look at this date again. I looked. October 14th, 2022. The same week, I now realized that Renee had posted the photo of her new handbag. This isn't just about the money, Todd said, his voice dropping to something barely audible over the espresso machine behind us. I think there's something else going on. Something bigger. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked scared. His jaw tightened. His knuckles went white around his coffee cup. I need to show you what I found in her email. He'd gotten into it almost by accident, he explained. A shared family Google account they used for Mason's school calendar and pediatrician appointments. One Renee had forgotten still synced to Todd's tablet. Buried under years of school newsletters and dentist reminders, he'd found a chain of confirmation emails from a leasing office called Aspen Court Apartments, a modest complex 15 minutes outside Brookhaven, a studio unit leased under the name R. Salas paid in cash deposits every month for 14 months running. Salas. Derek Salas, it turned out, was a personal trainer at Ironclad Fitness, the same gym Renee had joined the spring after Mason was born, the same gym whose training sessions had eaten every Wednesday evening for years, the same contact saved in her phone as Mason's swim coach. Todd had spent the previous night reading every message he could find. Renee and Derek had been involved for over a year, since a few months after she'd joined Ironclad Fitness looking, she'd told everyone to get her body back. The apartment wasn't cheap, not for someone claiming she couldn't scrape together $40 for a field trip, and the money to cover it, Todd now believed, hadn't come only from their joint accounts, where Renee had grown careful about leaving traces. It had come in pieces from family, from me, in the form of a preschool emergency that had never been an emergency at all, from Grandma Joan. And here Todd stopped and looked at me strangely, because I'd already told him this part without realizing what it meant. The same $2,000 for the same custody scare I'd filed away years earlier as an unremarkable family favor. It hadn't been unremarkable. It had been rent. From Aunt Peg, who'd apparently given her $1,200 for a non-existent orthodontist consultation the same month Aspen Court's leasing office sent a late notice for a missed deposit. I sat there doing my own version of Todd's math, running the dates backward through years I'd lived through without ever seeing the pattern. The preschool emergency, the custody scare, the orthodontist that never existed. Each one small enough to seem plausible on its own, urgent enough that nobody thought to ask for proof. Always tied to Mason's name, because Mason's name was the one nobody in this family would ever interrogate. She hadn't just been unfaithful. She'd built an entire quiet economy out of it, funded by the people who loved her most, laundered through the one subject none of us would ever say no to. The childless tax invoice, the $42,000 demand she'd staged at Thanksgiving with a folder and a rehearsed speech, hadn't been about fairness at all. It had been about a shortfall. Todd had started asking sharper questions about their finances that fall, tightening the household budget after a slow quarter at Bennett Distribution, and Renee had needed a new defensible source of cash before he noticed the gaps. What better cover than family obligation? What better shield than turning her own resentment of my life into a moral case nobody at that table would dare argue with in public? If I'd signed that agreement, if I'd started sending $500 a month like she wanted, it wouldn't have gone toward Mason's shoes or his school supplies. It would have gone 15 minutes outside Brookhaven, into a studio apartment with somebody else's name half attached to the lease. Everything I'd thought was petty jealousy, everything I'd absorbed as the cost of being the childless sister in a family that worshipped motherhood, had been a smokescreen for something else entirely. I sat in that coffee shop and felt something in my chest go very quiet, the specific stillness that comes right before a storm you already know is coming. Todd asked me, almost apologetically, if I'd come with him when he told her he knew. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The confrontation happened the following Sunday, at my parents' house again, though this time nobody pretended it was a casual dinner. Todd had asked my mother to gather everyone. No explanation given, just a request that felt heavy enough that she didn't argue. Mason stayed the night at a friend's house on Todd's insistence, a small mercy none of us discussed out loud, but all of us were grateful for. My mother had put the leaf back in the dining table without knowing why she needed the extra room, and by 6 o'clock that evening it held all of us, my parents, my grandmother, Aunt Peg, Todd, Renee, and me. The good china put away this time in favor of ordinary plates, as if some part of my mother had known instinctively that this wasn't a night for anything fragile. Renee arrived already defensive, sensing something in the air the way she always could. She was dressed carefully carefully, hair done, the way she dressed whenever she needed a room to believe her before she'd said a word. She sat across from Todd at the dining table, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her, the way you feel sorry for anyone about to have the floor pulled out from under them, even someone who built the floor out of lies. Todd didn't raise his voice. That was the part I remember most clearly. How quiet he was, laying out printed pages one at a time like he was dealing cards, his hands steadier than I expected given how badly they'd shaken in the coffee shop 2 days earlier. The lease agreements, the bank transfers, screenshots of messages between Renee and Derek that he read only the dates and subject lines of, sparing her whatever dignity remained in not having the words themselves spoken aloud at her parents' dinner table. "You didn't need $42,000 from your sister," he said. "You needed a cover story so I wouldn't notice where our money was actually going." Renee went white, then red, then white again. "Where did you get those?" she said, her voice climbing. "Those are private. You went through my private accounts?" "They're our accounts," Todd said. "Every one of them. You made sure of that when you needed my income to qualify for the mortgage." Renee's face cycled through every tactic she had after that. Denial first. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is insane. You're trying to humiliate me in front of my own family." Then gaslighting. "You're twisting things. You always do this when you're stressed about work. This is exactly the anger issue your therapist warned you about." Then, when neither landed, tears, real ones this time, the kind that come when a performance finally runs out of script. "I've been drowning," she said, her hands pressed flat against the table. "Nobody in this family has ever once asked if I was okay. I made mistakes because I was desperate, not because I'm a bad person. You told our daughter's aunt she doesn't love him for free," Todd said. "You used our son to punish your sister for a decision that was never hers to answer for, and this whole time you were doing it to buy yourself an apartment with another man." My father, who almost never speaks first at anything, set down his water glass with a sound louder than he probably intended. $2,000, he said, looking at his mother-in-law instead of his daughter, because he couldn't quite make himself look at Renee yet. "Joan gave you $2,000 for a lawyer that never existed. Do you understand what that is? That's not a mistake. That's a plan." My grandmother, 81 years old, sitting at the head of the table where she'd sat every Sunday for 40 years, spoke next, her voice not raised, not shaking. "I gave you money for a custody scare that didn't exist," she said. "I want it back. Not because I need it, because I want you to say out loud what you did with it." Renee opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Aunt Peg added her own piece. The $1,200, the fake orthodontist bill, delivered flatly without drama, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd shouted. "I thought I was helping my great-nephew," she said. "I wasn't. I was helping you rent somewhere to meet a man who isn't his father." I waited until the table went quiet before I said my piece. I'd rehearsed it in the car on the way over, the way Renee must have rehearsed her Thanksgiving speech, except mine wasn't a performance. It was just true. "I spent 7 years being the aunt who showed up. No charge, no complaints. Because I loved your son, and I loved you, even when you made that hard," I said. "You didn't just ask me for money. You told a room full of people that the love I gave your child for free was a debt I owed you. You let Mason believe I might stop showing up. I'm not angry about the folder, Renee. I'm done being your safety net so you can keep hiding what you actually spend it on. That's not a sister. That's a landlord I never agreed to pay." Nobody said anything for a long time after that. Renee looked around the table, at Todd's stone face, at our grandmother's folded hands, at our father staring at the tablecloth, at Aunt Peg's crossed arms, waiting for someone, anyone, to take her side the way they always eventually had. Nobody moved. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my sister had nothing to say at all. Todd filed for divorce 11 days later. What followed was the part nobody warns you about. Not the confrontation itself, which is almost cinematic in how clean it feels in the moment, but the long, ugly unspooling afterward. The part that takes months instead of minutes. Todd took it the hardest in ways that surprised me. He'd built an entire decade of his adult life around a version of Renee that had never fully existed, and losing that wasn't the same as losing her. It was closer to grief for a person who died without a funeral. He stopped eating properly for a few weeks that winter. He started seeing a counselor on Tuesdays, something Renee had mocked him for even considering back when their marriage still had a pulse. When I asked him once gently how he was holding up, he said something I've thought about often since. "I keep trying to figure out which parts were real," he said. "Was any of it real? Or was I just paying rent on a version of her that only existed when it was convenient?" I didn't have a good answer for him. I still don't. Bethany, Renee's oldest friend, ended up playing a bigger role than any of us expected. She'd known Renee since middle school, longer than almost anyone else in her orbit, and once the full shape of things became clear, she didn't flinch from it the way I half expected a lifelong friend to. She reached out to Todd's lawyer voluntarily, offered a signed statement about the daycare loan Renee had asked her for 2 years earlier, $600 that had never been repaid, and had never, as it turned out, gone toward daycare at all. I loved her enough to believe her for a long time, Bethany told me, the two of us sharing a booth at a diner neither of us had been to together before, the kind of vinyl-seated place that smelled like burnt coffee and syrup no matter the hour. I don't know if that makes me a good friend or a fool. Maybe both. I told her it made her human, which is the kindest true thing I could think to say. We stayed another hour after that, talking about nothing important, the way you do when you're trying to remember what an ordinary friendship feels like after wading through someone else's Renee's wreckage together. My parents, to their credit and my surprise, didn't retreat into their old habit of smoothing things over for Renee's benefit. My father, who'd spent 38 years being the kind of dad who avoided conflict at all costs, drove to Grandma Jones' house the week after the confrontation and sat with her while she called the bank to see if there was any way to trace the $2,000 she'd sent. There wasn't, not really. Not once it had passed through Renee's account and out the other side. My mother stopped taking Renee's calls for a full month, which I'd never seen her do to anyone in her life. When she finally did answer, she told me later it was only to say, "I love you and I'm still your mother, but I'm not going to lie for you anymore." Aunt Peg became an unlikely ally in all of it, showing up at my office one afternoon with a banker's box of her own, statements, texts, a paper trail she'd apparently been quietly compiling since the Sunday confrontation, in case Todd's lawyer needed corroboration for the pattern of it. "I should have said something sooner," she told me. I thought I was the only one she'd asked. Turns out I was just one of a list. Derek Salas, for what it's worth, disappeared from the story almost immediately. Todd went to Ironclad Fitness the week after the confrontation, not to make a scene, just to cancel the family membership, and learned from the front desk that Derek had quietly stopped taking new clients and switched his schedule to a different location across town. Renee tried calling him twice in the weeks that followed, according to the phone records that later surfaced in the divorce filing. He didn't answer either time. Whatever he told her about wanting a future together apparently hadn't survived contact with an actual ruined marriage and a mediation calendar. I don't know if that hurt her more or less than everything else. I never asked. Her real estate career took a hit too, though not from anything I did. Heartland Realty's office was small enough that gossip traveled fast, and a broker who'd fielded 2 calls from Todd's divorce attorney requesting financial records eventually decided Renee's client list needed restructuring. She wasn't fired outright. She was quietly moved to open houses and lead generation, the unglamorous, low-commission end of the business, the kind of demotion nobody announces but everybody understands. Grandma Jones started watching Mason 2 afternoons a week, while Todd worked through the early brutal logistics of separating a life, new apartment listings, a lawyer's retainer, the specific exhaustion of dividing a shared bank account that had secrets baked into every line. I picked up my usual Wednesday and added a second afternoon on Fridays, and Mason, for all the chaos swirling around him, seemed steadier with more routine, not less. Kids are strange that way. They don't need the truth explained to them in full. They need somebody to still show up on Wednesdays. Linda, Todd's mother, surprised everyone, myself included. She drove up from Columbus most weekends that first spring, not to take sides loudly, but to sit with Todd in his new apartment and help him figure out which dishes were his, which framed photos were worth keeping, and which belonged in a box in the garage. She testified at the custody hearing, calm and specific, about the $400 Renee had once taken from her under a false pretense, a detail that carried weight precisely because Linda had no reason to lie, and every reason, as Renee's mother-in-law of 9 years, to have stayed quiet instead. "I liked her," Linda told me once, in the hallway outside the mediation room. "I still don't hate her. I just can't pretend anymore, and I won't ask my grandson to either." Renee didn't go quietly. She showed up at my office unannounced on a Tuesday in February, mascara already run from crying in her car in the parking lot, demanding I fix this, as though I'd broken something rather than simply stopped absorbing the cost of what she'd already broken herself. "You destroyed my marriage," she said, standing in my doorway while my hardware store client waited awkwardly in the hall behind her, over an invoice. "You destroyed your marriage the day you signed an apartment lease with another man's rent money and called it Mason's daycare," I said. "I just did the math. You could have handled this privately," she said, "family to family. Instead, you humiliated me in front of everyone I love." "I sent one folder in the mail," I said. "You're the one who staged a speech at Thanksgiving with a notary block on it. If you wanted privacy, you should have asked for it privately." She didn't have anything to say to that. She stood in my doorway for another few seconds, looking, for the first time in longer than I could remember, genuinely lost, before she turned and left without another word. My client, once she'd gone, asked quietly if I was all right. I told her I was, and I meant it, which surprised me more than the visit itself had. She tried my parents next, asking for a loan toward a lawyer, framing it as a favor to Mason's stability rather than to herself. My mother said no, gently, for what I believe was the first time in Renee's entire adult life. She tried the neighborhood next, spinning a version of events among the other moms at Mason's school where I was recast as a bitter, jealous woman who'd never forgiven her sister for having a family, a story that might have worked, except several of those same women had, by then, heard secondhand about the leasing agreement and the fake orthodontist bill from Aunt Peg's side of things, and the narrative didn't hold the way Renee needed it to. She called me at 11:40 at night in March, 3 months after the confrontation, her voice thick and unsteady in a way that made me think, for one alarmed second, that something had actually happened to Mason. Nothing had. She just wanted to talk, she said, the way we used to talk, before any of this. She cried for a while about how lonely the apartment was, how quiet, how nobody called her back anymore. I listened for 20 minutes without saying much, because some old, stubborn part of me still didn't know how to hang up on my sister in distress. Then she asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I could front her a few $100s until her next commission check cleared. I told her goodnight and turned my phone on silent for the rest of the week. The custody mediation was its own slow grind, spread across 4 sessions in a beige conference room downtown that that smelled permanently of burnt coffee. Todd was granted primary custody that spring, with Renee getting supervised weekend visits for the first several months while she worked through what her lawyer delicately called a period of instability. She fought it hard, at one point telling the mediator that Todd was unfit because of anger issues, a claim that fell apart the moment the mediator asked for specifics and got none. He raised his voice one time, the mediator finally said, flipping through Renee's own written statement. On the night he discovered a secondary residence and a year-long affair. I'm going to need something more than that. Renee didn't have anything more than that. She never did. Not once the paperwork was on the table instead of just her version of events. I sat in the hallway outside that particular session, not allowed inside since I wasn't a party to the custody dispute, and watched Renee's lawyer step out twice for hushed phone calls that didn't sound like they were going well. When Todd came out afterward, he looked lighter than I'd seen him look in months. Not happy exactly, but unburdened, the way you look after setting down something you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had weight. It's over, he said. Primary custody. She gets him every other weekend, supervised for now. I hugged him in the hallway of a beige government building, and neither of us cared who saw. There was a tax complication too. Money Renee had received informally from family members over the years, reframed by her own accountant, ironically, as undeclared gifts that raised questions with the IRS she hadn't anticipated having to answer. There was a smaller, quieter discovery in the middle of it all that hurt more than the larger ones somehow. Todd found, going through their accounts with his lawyer, that Mason's 529 college savings plan, opened the month he was born with contributions from both sets of grandparents, had been drawn down twice in the past 2 years for educational expenses that turned out to be nothing of the sort. $900 here, $1,200 there, small enough not to trigger alarm, redirected toward the same accounts that had eventually funded Aspen Court. Todd didn't tell Renee he'd found it. He simply started a new account in Mason's name alone, one she had no access to, and quietly asked the rest of us if we ever wanted to contribute toward Mason's future again, to send it there instead. I did, that same week, an amount I won't put a number to here because for once it wasn't about proving anything. It was just for Mason. The house on Cardinal Lane went up for sale that summer. The equity split down a line drawn by lawyers instead of affection, and Renee moved twice in 4 months before landing somewhere she could actually afford on her reduced commission, and her half of a smaller settlement than she'd clearly expected. I didn't take any satisfaction in any of it. I'd built invoices out of anger, not out of any wish to see my sister audited by the federal government or priced out of her own zip code. And when it happened anyway, it just felt like watching a slow-motion car accident you'd already warned someone about. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, on a Wednesday in April, I found myself sitting in my car outside Mason's school, waiting to pick him up, and I let myself think about a specific afternoon from 1998. Renee, 12 years old, teaching me to ride a bike in the cul-de-sac behind our childhood house, running alongside me with her hand on the back of my seat, shouting, I've got you, until she didn't, until I was pedaling on my own and she was standing in the street, grinning, proud of me in a way that had nothing to do with what it cost her. I thought, too, about a summer years later, the two of us 17 and 21, splitting a $6 milkshake at the Dairy Freeze on Route 9 because neither of us had enough cash for our own, arguing over who got the last of it, laughing so hard at something forgettable that I'd nearly driven off the road pulling out of the lot. I don't know when the sister who split a milkshake with me became the sister who itemized my worth at a holiday dinner table. Somewhere in the space between those two memories, something had gone wrong that neither of us noticed happening in real time, the way a house doesn't feel like it's sinking until you notice the doors don't close right anymore. I don't know exactly when that sister disappeared. Maybe she never fully did. Maybe some version of her is still in there somewhere, buried under 20 years of feeling like the family's spectacle instead of its favorite. I mourned her that afternoon, briefly and privately, before Mason came running out the school doors and climbed into my back seat asking if we could get Dairy Freeze. I didn't tell him what I'd been thinking about. I just said yes and drove, and let the grief sit quietly in the passenger seat where it belonged. Mason's 8th birthday fell that August, 6 months after the divorce was finalized, and Todd asked if I'd help plan it, the way I always had. We did it at the park on Kessler Avenue, the same park I'd driven him to every Wednesday since he was small enough to need help on the swings. Dinosaur theme, a cake shaped like a volcano that Mason insisted needed more lava. Renee came for an hour, by agreement, stiff and careful in a sundress that looked like it belonged to someone else's version of that day. She stayed near the edge of things, taking photos, and left before the cake was cut, hugging Mason a beat too long at the gate before she got in her car. I watched her go, and felt something complicated settle in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not anger either, just the specific tiredness of loving someone you no longer fully trust. It's been a little over a year now since that Thanksgiving. Mason is 8, in 2nd grade, and spends most weeknights at Todd's new place a mile from mine, with Wednesdays and Fridays still reserved for me. A routine none of us have needed to renegotiate since the custody arrangement settled. He's traded dinosaurs for astronauts this year, which means our Wednesday drives are now narrated entirely in facts about Jupiter's moons, and I've learned more about the solar system in 4 months than I retained in 12 years of school. Todd bought a modest 3-bedroom near the elementary school last spring, close enough that Mason could keep the same bus stop, the same friends, the same version of normal a divorce so often steals from kids without anyone quite meaning it to. He's dating someone now, carefully, quietly, a nurse named Priya he met through a coworker, and the 2 times I've met her, she's asked good questions about Mason's allergies and remembered the answers, which is more effort than I watched Renee put in during several stretches of their marriage. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's true, and because Mason deserves people around him who pay attention. My bookkeeping practice has grown, oddly enough, partly because a few people in town heard some version of the story and decided a woman who could build a 7-year itemized ledger out of spite was exactly the kind of person they wanted handling their small business accounts. I hired an assistant last winter, a recent graduate named Priya, a different Priya, small towns are like that, and I moved into a bigger office 2 doors down from the old one, the one with actual windows. Some mornings I get there early just to sit in the extra light before the phones start ringing. I try not to think too hard about what the whole ordeal says about my professional reputation now. Mostly I try to be grateful that something good grew out of ground that ugly. Renee lives in a 1-bedroom apartment on the other side of Brookhaven, near the strip mall with the nail salon she used to go to before all of this, back when $8,000 for cosmetic work was still a secret instead of a headline in her own divorce filing. She works the open houses now, weekends mostly, building her client list back up one modest starter home at a time, driving a car 2 years older than the one she used to have. Todd tells me when Mason mentions it that she seems steadier than she was that first year, that the desperation has quieted into something closer to ordinary sadness. I hope that's true. I mean that honestly, without irony, even after everything. Our contact is thin, a birthday card in March, an occasional strained hour at a school event where we're both careful and polite, the specific choreography of 2 people who used to know each other completely, and now only know how to be civil. She's never apologized for the leasing agreement, or the money, or the way she used her own son as leverage against me at a table full of people who loved us both. I don't think she sees any of it the way I do. I've made a kind of peace with that, the way you make peace with weather you can't change. You stop expecting the sky to apologize and just learn to dress for what it actually does, day after day, instead of what you wish it would. Grandma Joan passed this past winter, quietly in her sleep, in the same house where the whole thing started at that Thanksgiving table. The funeral was held at the little Methodist church she'd attended for 60 years, the pews packed with people who'd known her longer than either of my parents had been alive. Renee came. We sat 2 pews apart, Mason between us at the reception afterward, unaware he was the bridge holding 2 halves of a broken thing together. Afterward, in the parking lot, Renee said the only thing close to an apology I've heard from her since the divorce. I don't know how to undo any of it, she said. I don't think I even fully understand how it happened. I told her I believed that, which was true, and that believing it didn't mean I was ready to hand her my trust back along with it. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. Maybe she had. Todd and I still talk most weeks, mostly logistics, pickup times, school forms, the occasional joke about Mason's latest astronomical obsession, but there's a warmth in it now that feels earned rather than assigned. 2 people who got dragged through something ugly together and came out the other side able to look each other in the eye. He thanked me once, unprompted, for the invoices, of all things. You didn't know what you were handing me, he said, but you handed me the truth anyway, and I needed it more than I wanted it. I told him I hadn't done it for him. I'd done it for myself and for Mason, and it had simply turned out that the truth doesn't care who it ends up saving. I still keep her number saved in my phone, under her real name instead of anything bitter I could have relabeled it. Not because I'm waiting for a reconciliation I don't expect. Because Mason will need us in the same room someday. A graduation, a wedding, some ordinary milestone that deserves both of us showing up without theater. I'll be there. I always was. People ask me sometimes if I regret the invoice, if I wish I'd handled it differently, quieter, kinder, kept it inside the family instead of on paper where it couldn't be argued with. I don't. I didn't send it to get paid. I sent it to show her, in numbers she couldn't argue with, exactly what family costs when you tally it out of spite instead of giving it freely. She taught me that lesson first, at a table full of people who loved us both and said nothing. I just handed it back to her, itemized, dated, and true. What I lost that year wasn't a sister who loved me. I'd lost that gradually, long before Thanksgiving, in small withdrawals I hadn't noticed accumulating, the same way you don't notice a bank account emptying until the day the check bounces. What I lost that year was the idea of her, the girl who ran alongside my bike shouting that she had me, who split a $6 milkshake with me on a summer night neither of us has ever brought up since, who I'd spent 3 decades hoping might come back if I was patient enough, generous enough, quiet enough about the cost. She isn't coming back. I know that now, and some nights that knowledge still finds its way into my chest at the strangest moments. Standing in a grocery store line, hearing a song we used to sing in the car as kids, the 2 of us off-key and unbothered by it, windows down, nowhere urgent to be. I still show up on Wednesdays anyway because love, the real kind, was never supposed to be a ledger in the first place. It was Renee who taught me otherwise, the hard way, at a table set with china older than either of us. And it's Mason, climbing into my backseat every Wednesday afternoon asking for ice cream and talking about the rings of Saturn, who reminds me I was right to give it freely for as long as I did, and that I'll go on giving it freely, invoice or no invoice, for as long as he'll let me.